Ever feel like you're tilting at windmills,
Yeah.
chasing after ideals in a world that's, well, lost its sense of romance?
Hmm.
Well, you're not alone.
You're in good company.
You're in very good company.
Yeah.
Today we're diving into a book that captured this feeling centuries ago, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes.
It's fascinating how a story written in 17th century Spain can still resonate so deeply with us today. And that's exactly why we're taking this deep dive to uncover not just the plot of Don Quixote,
Right.
but what makes it a literary landmark and why it's considered the first modern novel.
And to help us navigate this literary landscape, we've got insights from Professor William Eggington, author of The Man Who Invented Fiction: How Cervantes Created the Modern World.
Great book.
Now, before we get lost in the adventures of a knight errant,
Yeah.
let's set the stage.
Okay.
Cervantes himself led quite an extraordinary life.
Absolutely. He wasn't just a writer. He was a soldier who fought in the Battle of Lepanto.
Wow.
A pivotal moment in European history.
Yep.
He was captured and held prisoner in Algiers for 5 years.
Oh, wow.
He even worked as a tax collector. Imagine that.
Talk about drawing from experience.
Right.
It's no wonder his writing feels so grounded, so real, and yet he creates a character like Don Quixote,
Yeah.
a man who's completely lost in a world of fantasy.
And that's where Cervantes' genius really shines through.
Yeah.
Don Quixote is this lovable, eccentric character who truly believes he's a knight errant.
Right.
Even though the age of chivalry is long gone, he sets off on these ridiculous quests,
Yeah.
mistaking windmills for giants and flocks of sheep for enemy armies.
Right. We've all seen those iconic images.
Yeah.
But Professor Eggington argues that there's so much more to it than just slapstick humor.
Oh, absolutely.
He says that Cervantes uses humor to highlight some profound truths about the human condition, about the clash between our ideals and the often harsh realities of the world.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons Don Quixote resonated so widely when it was published. First in 1605, and then the second part in 1615.
Wow.
It wasn't just a Spanish phenomenon, it became a global sensation.
Early.
People were connecting with this character, with his struggles, his delusions, his unwavering belief in a world that didn't quite exist anymore.
So it's not just about laughing at Don Quixote's misadventures.
Not at all. We laugh with him, certainly.
Okay.
But there's also a sense of recognition of empathy. We see ourselves in his follies, in his idealism, in his longing for a world that maybe never was.
Right.
And that brings us to another key point. Professor Eggington raises Cervantes' masterful use of irony.
Okay, so we know irony when we see it,
Right.
but what makes Cervantes' approach so unique?
He doesn't just use irony for comedic effect.
Okay.
He weaves it into the very fabric of the narrative, creating this complex interplay between what's real and what's imagined.
Yeah.
Remember, he presents Don Quixote as a true history,
Right.
even though it's clearly a work of fiction.
Right.
And this blurring of lines forces us to question everything we're reading, to engage with the story on a deeper level.
So he's making us active participants in the storytelling,
Exactly.
not just passive readers.
Professor Eggington calls this collaborative reading,
Okay.
and he argues that it's one of the defining characteristics of modern fiction.
Wow.
Cervantes isn't just telling us a story.
Right.
He's inviting us into a dialogue,
Okay.
a conversation about truth fiction and the very nature of reality.
That's fascinating. And it makes me wonder how much of Cervantes' own life,
Yeah.
his own experiences with war captivity and cultural clashes,
Mm-hmm.
fed into this unique way of seeing the world.
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore further when we delve into the specifics of how Cervantes' life experiences shaped his masterpiece. You know, it's incredible to think that Cervantes was writing Don Quixote during a time of immense change in Spain. The Spanish Empire was at its peak, but cracks were starting to show.
Oh, really?
The influx of wealth from the New World created economic disparities, and traditional social structures were being challenged.
So it wasn't all sunshine and roses in Golden Age Spain.
Not at all. And Cervantes captures this sense of unease, this anxiety about the future in Don Quixote.
Okay.
He does it subtly, of course, through humor and satire.
Right.
But it's definitely their take, for instance, the character of Sancho Panza, Don Quixote's loyal squire.
Sancho, the voice of reason, the pragmatist to Don Quixote's dreamer.
Exactly. But Sancho also represents the common people of Spain,
Oh.
those struggling to make ends meet in a rapidly changing world. He's constantly worried about where his next meal is coming from, about the practical realities that Don Quixote so blithely ignores.
That's a great point. It's like Cervantes is showing us the two sides of Spain.
Yeah.
the grand ideals of chivalry and empire, and the everyday struggles of ordinary people.
Precisely, and it's through this juxtaposition that he creates this incredibly rich and nuanced portrait of his time.
Wow.
But what's even more remarkable is how he connects these very specific historical circumstances
Yeah.
to these universal human truths.
You mean like the clash between ideals and reality that we talked about earlier?
Yes, but also the power of stories to shape our perceptions.
Hey.
The way we often cling to narratives even when they no longer serve us.
Right.
Don Quixote, after all, is a man living in a world of his own making.
Yeah.
A world constructed from the chivalric romances he's obsessed with.
Which makes me wonder, are we all a little bit like Don Quixote? I mean, don't we all have our own narratives, our own ways of filtering reality
Yeah.
based on our experiences and beliefs?
That's a question that Cervantes seems to be inviting us to ask.
Okay.
He's not just poking fun at Don Quixote's delusions.
Yeah.
He's prompting us to examine our own ways of seeing the world,
Mm.
to question whether we're clinging to outdated narratives, tilting at windmills of our own creation.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to human nature,
Yeah.
showing us that we're all capable of believing in things that aren't quite true,
Right.
of chasing after ideals that may be unattainable.
And he does it with a sense of humor and compassion that makes his work so enduring because, let's face it, even though we recognize Don Quixote's folly, there's a part of us that admires his idealism, his unwavering belief in a better world.
I think that's what makes him such a compelling character.
Yeah.
We can laugh at his misadventures,
Right.
but we also feel a sense of sympathy, even admiration, for his refusal to give up on his dreams.
And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of Don Quixote.
Okay.
Its impact on literature. Professor Eggington argues that Cervantes' unique approach to storytelling, his blurring of the lines between fiction and reality, laid the groundwork for what we now consider the modern novel.
Okay, so we've talked about how Don Quixote reflects its time, about its universal themes.
Right.
But how did it actually change the way stories were told?
Well, for one thing, it's the depth of characterization.
Okay.
Cervantes' characters aren't just two-dimensional figures. They're complex, contradictory, full of depth and nuance. They feel real relatable even when they're behaving in absurd or outlandish ways.
And this realism, this ability to create believable characters, even in fantastical situations,
Yeah.
is part of what makes Don Quixote so engaging.
Absolutely.
We're drawn into their world. We feel their joys and sorrows, even when we know it's all made up.
Exactly. And this ability to create that sense of immersion, of emotional connection with characters who exist only in the realm of imagination is a hallmark of modern fiction. It's what allows us to step outside ourselves to experience the world through different perspectives, to develop empathy and understanding for those who may be very different from us.
That's a pretty powerful thing.
It is.
The ability of stories to transport us, to transform us, to make us see the world in new ways.
Yeah.
It almost feels like Cervantes was ahead of his time.
Absolutely. And there's another element of his writing that feels remarkably modern.
Oh.
His playful use of language.
Okay.
Think about the way he plays with the idea of truth in the novel. He's constantly blurring the lines between fact and fiction, reminding us that meaning is never fixed, but always open to interpretation.
That feels so relevant to our world today,
It does.
with all the talk of misinformation and fake news.
Right.
It's like Cervantes was grappling with these same issues of truth and perception centuries ago.
Exactly. And that's what makes his work so timeless. He's not just commenting on the specific political or cultural climate of his time. He's tapping into these fundamental human dilemmas.
Yeah.
These questions about how we make sense of the world, how we construct meaning, how we distinguish truth from falsehood.
It's almost like he's anticipating the challenges we face in the digital age, where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Right.
And have to constantly filter what's real and what's not.
Precisely. And he's reminding us that the act of reading, of engaging with stories is not a passive one.
Yeah.
We have to be active participants, questioning, analyzing, and ultimately constructing our own meaning from the narratives we encounter.
It's amazing to think that a book written over 400 years ago can still feel so relevant to our lives today.
It is.
But I think that speaks to the power of Don Quixote,
Yeah.
to Cervantes' ability to tap into these enduring human truths.
Absolutely. And one of those truths that really shines through, particularly in light of what we were just discussing, is the importance of perspective. Don Quixote, with his head full of chivalric romances, shows us how our individual experiences and the stories we consume can shape the way we see the world.
It's like he's created his own reality,
Yeah,
one that's completely at odds with the world around him.
exactly. And while it's easy to dismiss him as delusional,
Right.
there's also something admirable about his unwavering idealism, his refusal to let go of his dreams, even in the face of ridicule and hardship.
It's that tension, isn't it, between our desire for a more noble romantic world
Yeah.
and the often harsh realities we face. It feels like something we all grapple with on some level.
I think so, and that's what makes Don Quixote such a powerful and enduring work. It's not just a funny story about a crazy old man chasing windmills. It's a reflection on the human condition,
Right.
on our capacity for both great wisdom and utter foolishness, on our constant struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world that often feels chaotic and absurd.
And maybe that's why, despite all his misadventures, Don Quixote remains such a sympathetic character.
I think so.
We see ourselves in his idealism, in his longing for a world that might not exist, but that we secretly wish did.
I think that's a big part of his appeal, and there's another aspect of his character that I find incredibly touching, and that's his need for connection.
Oh, okay.
Don Quixote, for all his eccentricities, craves companionship.
Yeah.
He needs someone to share his adventures, his dreams, even his delusions.
And he finds it in Sancho Panza, right? That unlikely friendship, that bond between the dreamer and the realist,
Absolutely.
is one of the most endearing aspects of the book.
And it reminds us that even in our moments of folly and our most absurd pursuits, we need each other. We need those human connections, those bonds of love and friendship to navigate the challenges of life, to find meaning and purpose, and ultimately to make sense of this crazy, beautiful world we inhabit.
I love that it's such a simple truth,
It is.
but so often overlooked. We get so caught up in our own heads, our own pursuits,
Right.
that we forget the importance of those connections, those relationships that ground us, that remind us of what truly matters.
And that's another reason why I think Don Quixote continues to resonate with readers centuries later. It speaks to something fundamental about the human experience, about our need for connection, for meaning, for something to believe in, even when the world around us seems to be falling apart.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context of Don Quixote, its enduring themes, its impact on literature,
Right.
and even its relevance to our lives today. But before we wrap up, I have to ask, what about those who haven't yet experienced this masterpiece? What would you say to entice them to pick up a copy and embark on their own adventure with Don Quixote and Sancho Panza?
I would say this: if you're looking for a book that will make you laugh, make you think, and make you feel deeply connected to the human experience, then Don Quixote is a must-read. It's a timeless tale of adventure idealism and the enduring power of the human spirit.
And even if they don't get all the 17th century Spanish jokes?
Even then, because the heart of the story, the human truths, it explores transcend time and culture. It's a book that speaks to something universal within us, something that recognizes the absurdity of life, the often tragic gap between our ideals and our reality, but does so with a sense of compassion, even forgiveness.
So it's a book for anyone who's ever felt like they're tilting at windmills, anyone who's ever chased a dream,
Yeah.
anyone who's ever felt the pang of disillusionment but still clung to the hope for a better world.
Beautifully put. And for those who want to delve even deeper into Cervantes' life and work, I highly recommend checking out Professor Egginton's book, The Man Who Invented Fiction. It's an engaging and insightful exploration of the man behind the masterpiece, and it sheds light on just how revolutionary Don Quixote was and continues to be.
So we've got our book recommendations, and I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Don Quixote. We have. We've explored its historical context, its literary innovations, its lasting impact on culture, and even its philosophical underpinnings. But the conversation doesn't end here.
Exactly. This is just the beginning. Don Quixote is a book that stays with you,
Yeah.
that sparks new questions, that challenges you to see the world in new ways.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway from this deep dive.
Maybe so.
Don't just read Don Quixote experience. Let it challenge your assumptions, spark your imagination, and remind you of the enduring power of stories to shape our lives. And who knows, you might even find yourself tilting at a few windmills along the way.
I think Cervantes would approve.